Good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome you here to Leeds Beckett University and to the inaugural professorial lecture of Teresa Stoppani, Professor of Architecture in the School of Art, Architecture and Design. As a university, we have a unique opportunity to contribute to social and economic progress in our region and for our region through our research and our enterprise activities. We're currently celebrating our growing reputation in research following our best ever assessment results in the Research Excellence Framework exercise, the results of which were released, as you know, I'm sure, last December. And every year we contribute an estimated £500 million to the economy. So we have strong commercial, business and professional links, and our research is applied directly to those links, providing practical solutions and innovations. We cover a very wide range of research disciplines, and in tonight's lecture, Professor Stoppani will explore the work of 18th century Italian designer, engraver and architect Giovanni Battista Piranesi. She will re-examine Piranesi's critical project on classical architecture and urban spaces to suggest that his work resonates with the current shift towards an architecture of change and materiality beyond form. Teresa is an architectural theorist and critic, and began her academic career teaching architectural design and theory at IUAV University in Venice. Before joining Leeds Beckett University in 2013, she also worked for the Architectural Association and the University of Greenwich, both in London, the University of Technology Sydney, and RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. Here at Leeds Beckett, Teresa is head of architecture in the School of Art, Architecture and Design. She directs a PhD in architecture programme and supervises postgraduate dissertations and theses. Teresa's research focuses on the relationship between architectural theory and the design process in the urban environment, addressing in particular the influence of other spatial and critical practices on architecture. Her writings are published internationally, and her book, Paradigm Islands, Manhattan and Venice, published by Routledge, explores the impasse of modernist architecture in historical context, while the forthcoming Unorthodox Ways to Rethink Architecture and the City, also to be published by Routledge, will propose a series of terms for the reconceptualization of the architecture of the city. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my very great pleasure to invite Professor Teresa Stoppani to present her inaugural professorial lecture, Symptoms of Modernity. Professor Stoppani.
Thank you very much. Before I start with Piranesi, why Piranesi, or who was Piranesi and who am I? I came here 2 years ago, and I don't know many of my colleagues, and you don't know me, so this is a sort of visual counterpart to what happened, or what's happening with me. This is a manifesto I wrote for the Architectural Biennale just before coming here, and in a way it forced me to summarize my ideas on what architecture is, and it informs the direction I've been trying to push the school in this period of time. Another passion of mine is the work on critical cartographies as they relate to the architectural project, which informs in part the work on Paradigm Islands. This is a very long and very dusty project, dusty in the sense that it's going to take a long time and it's sedimenting slowly, and this is a summary of what's happened so far. This is what I'm working, or I should be working at the moment, which is the forthcoming book, which addresses more the city, but also architecture in relation to it, and this will be one of the chapters in it. This is what I do here mainly, work with PhD students who are also colleagues, and we work together as a team both in research seminars and in teaching, and this is what we are as a group engaged in. This will happen in November, and it's now going to take most of our summer, I think. It all links together, and it links with what I'm going to discuss tonight. And I chose this topic because it keeps recurring in my work, and it's a sort of an obsession, and it will be a forthcoming book after I've done the others. But it's also something which I am very passionate about because it challenges the very role of what I am and what I do. It's a way for me to look at history from the point of view of the present, but also in the present. Not as a historian, which I'm not, I'm an architect and a theorist, but to understand that products of thinking, designing, drawing from the past remain still unresolved, and that's why they remain relevant for us today, and hence the title and the topic. I'm going to give you a sort of an overview of some key concepts which have occupied me in this project. And I'll jump across different projects, trying to explain why the work of this architect, but mainly engraver, continues to re-emerge in contemporary architectural discourse. The images he produced, the projects he produced, continue to raise issues that architecture continues to address in a process of historical reframing, ongoing self-definition, and not only within a critical discourse that remains internal to architecture through theoretical reconsiderations, but also in continuously questioning and redefining its role in relation to society, politics, and the complex forces that make the city. Most recently, in 2012, the exhibition and project Piranesi's Variations at the exhibition of the Biennale in Venice returned to explore and interpret Piranesi's Iconografia Campi Marzi with project by Eisenman Architects with his Yale students, a field of diagrams, which becomes this gold model. Jeff Kipnis of Ohio State, A Field of Dreams, and Pier Vittorio Aureli's practice Dogma, A Field of Walls. So a contemporary re-examination of Piranesi's critique of the classical language of architecture and urban space may suggest a reading that goes beyond the crisis of languages and resonates with current shifts in architecture, from the definition of a form to an ongoing process of working on its materiality. And by rereading Piranesi's work, we can identify in the crisis of the classical the possibilities which are actually already at work of an architecture of becoming. That is, an architecture beyond form which works with change and materiality. So what I would like to do today is to touch upon a few points in his work which anticipate and offer unresolved problems to contemporary architectural re-elaboration. And this continues to happen both through texts and projects and design experimentation. Piranesi was a Venetian. He was born in 1720. He trained as an engraver, a stage designer, and an architect, and he moved to Rome very young, at the age of 20. And there he remained, producing throughout his career numerous series of etchings and of mainly views of Rome and Roman antiquities, which offer the most famous descriptions and interpretations of the city and its times. Until recently, Italian trains had a Piranesi plate, of course, a copy on plastic laminate in every single compartment of the trains. So, but when I say that they offer a description and interpretation of the city and its time, what do I mean? I mean, by interpretation, Piranesi documents monuments and ruins and details, but this is never separate from a project that is not merely technical, visual, and graphic, but it always offers also a commentary on the given and proposes a project of reactivation rather than reconstruction. And this at the time is incredibly revolutionary. And so also, what are the times of the city for him? Rome's past and present coexist in his views. And so it is in his work that the magnificence of the past is celebrated, but rather than in a process of frozen reconstruction, the greatness of the antiquity is investigated in the fragments and in the crumbling present state and decaying social context of the city. To come to that, I need a digression in the step forward in the future. In 1980, Italian architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri publishes La Sfera e il Labirinto. The book is subtitled Avant-Gardes and Architecture from Piranesi to the 1970s, and this is major influence for my work. On the cover of the book, there's a detail of a collage by Raoul Hausmann, whose position within the Berlin Dada group Tafuri discusses in the text. Hausmann is the author of the Manifesto entitled The New Material in Painting, which he published in 1918. And the new material of painting that is proposed by the Manifesto is indeed the collage and its heterogeneous components, which include letters, numbers, images, and as in this case, even the author himself, both in form of text, the name, and photo portrait. It is his screaming face we see. What is the scream, though, in the metropolis and of the metropolis? It is a scream that in Hausmann's work becomes also poems, sound poems, which he calls phonemes, and poster poems, which are produced by the chance typographic lining up of letters or by reversing, chopping, and rearranging words. Tafuri discusses this, and he observes that Hausmann's, and I'm quoting, is an immersion in the sea of scrambled alphabets of the metropolis, an immersion that dominates such sea and holds it together, and that the technique of collage is, and I'm quoting again, an interiorization or an exteriorization of the impulses generated by the new Babylon, unquote. So this is a technique to absorb the subjective alienation provoked by the metropolis. Why am I showing you this? Because 10 years later, the book is translated and published in English, and the cover and the image on the cover changes. And Hausmann's collage is replaced by an even more unsettling image. It is the view of the back of the altar of San Basilio in the church of Santa Maria del Priorato in Rome, and it is one of the very few architectural commissions that Giovanni Battista Piranesi managed to get during his career and build. So what we see is the sphere of the title, and we see an interrupted vocabulary of classical moldings and decorations. Architecture is stripped to its basic elements. This is almost an anticipation of the experiments of the architects of the Enlightenment, which will follow 50 years later. And here I'm thinking of the autonomous volumes of Ledoux or the pure forms of Boulez. But at this stage, they're relegated to the back side of what looks like a Baroque altar. So it is, in fact, this nearly invisible built manifesto by Piranesi that triggers Tafuri's investigation of Piranesi's whole graphic work, as he searches for clues of modernity in the etchings. And the etchings, of course, and especially the prisons, are the labyrinth of the title. And they become a site of questioning and challenging, which is not only a challenging of architectural language, but also of the very nature of the architectural object and of space, and ultimately of the role of the architect. And I'll go through these steps. Let's stay with Tafuri for a moment. His attention concentrates on Piranesi's key projects, which are considered his most experimental and provocative works. And they are the ones which perform a spatial research more than addressing a linguistic polemic. And they are the carceri, the prisons. The carceri are published in two different stages. This is the first one, and this is the second, and Piranesi keeps adding features and details. The large college, the Ampio e Magnifico Collegio, I'm not getting into the details of this. Rome and its representation in broken maps and reconstruction in the Campo Marzio. They're all projects, and they are projects, they're not just images, which open a very dangerous door on the unknown for architecture, for an architecture which finds itself without rules once it suggests the dissolution of the city into a space of fragmentation and congestion. This begins to become a big problem. And it's here really that my questions start. So let's look at the carceri, which I argue, and I'm not alone, are not prisons. Piranesi was a very difficult person. He was irascible, but that also meant that he had a very agile and explosive mind, and descriptions of his personality abound. Piranesi has a dark brain for Marguerite Yourcenar. He's overflowing, William Chambers. He's fantastic, his friend Robert Adam. He's wicked, Tafuri himself. He's volcanic but disorganized, Mario Bevilacqua. So what are these carceri and why do they happen? The first stage, entitled Invenzioni capricciose di carceri, fanciful inventions of prisons, is followed by the carceri d'invenzione, imaginary prisons. Prisons remains in the title. But they are not a hallucination. They are a clear project of a dynamic architecture, and it's an architecture of the past that continues to transform under the action of time and man. And this is a detail which is at the very back of one of the prisons, which shows very clearly that it's not a prison, but it's an underground space in the city. Piranesi uses these elements of ancient architecture, which are characterized by massiveness and structural quality and overwhelm orders and ornamentation. They are substructures, they're water ducts and drains, they're underground vaults, or indeed, yes, perhaps maybe even prisons. But because of that, they can be exploited in a new project of spatial relations, transformations in habitation, and the definition of this space remains open, literally open. These prisons then may be sites of punishments, but they are clearly not sealed. They are not enclosed spaces of detention. The carceri are for Piranesi an architectural manifesto by images. They are produced at a crucial time when the discipline of architecture seemed to run the risk of being reduced to a pedestrian repetition of ancient forms and styles, of given languages which were critically appropriated. This is the time of the debate between Greek versus Roman origin of architecture and stylistic supremacy. While in the meantime, political and cultural scenarios in Europe, in European cities, were changing and were quite complex. So Piranesi works on paper and copper plates, and there he becomes free to experiment. He explores, and indeed he literally blows up the limits of classical architecture and produces spaces which are incredible, impossible, and they can define and contradict the established notion of type, composition, proportion, all the canons which regulated established architecture. So he uses the classical language but breaks the rules. in order to empty it of any meaning and symbolic value, and this is absolutely important. So the notion of prison remains a label and a justification that enables this spatial experimentation and delivers also indirectly a social and political, but also architectural message. The spaces that he represents are at times impossible. The conventions are challenged, the representation is detached from material construction and therefore becomes the space for the production of ideas. In particular, perspective is fragmented and it's used to represent a combination of multiple interiors, but again, building interiors or urban interiors, whose incongruent multiplicity is not only spatial but temporal. What is important is that these works are confined to operate within the boundaries of two-dimensional architectural representation, but their effects go well beyond the representation. As they represent, they construct and they propose a new notion of space, a space which is open, infinite, changing, smooth, and dynamic. And that is why this definition of space still attracts the attention of contemporary architectural practice. The Cartography then offer an interpretation of 18th century Rome with its present life, all the layers of its past, but they are also an impossible anticipation of a contemporary metropolitan condition. And the congestion which we saw in the Campo Marzio looks probably quite familiar to us. So paradoxically, the most effective interpretation of these spaces which we are offered comes from the most hallucinatory and hallucinated description of them. And it is because it is a description that is free from architectural conventions and logic constraints, and is therefore able to see, to really see the nature of these spaces, and as sites of an anxiety which is almost modern. And of course I'm thinking here of the voice of Thomas de Quincey. There's many layers here because de Quincey describes these spaces in the Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1820, so it's quite a long time after they were produced, but of course the prints were circulated. But he has never seen the etchings. So he reports a description of the prisons which he had heard from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which he calls dreams, and he records them as the scenery, and I'm quoting here, the scenery of his own visions during the delirium of a fever. So de Quincey describes something he has not seen, and he distorts the information. So in his description, Piranesi spaces become, and he calls them vast Gothic halls. They're not Gothic in style. But what he grasps is the dynamic and open nature of the spaces, which can only be described by experiencing them in motion and from within. So we are immediately in, as there is no outside to this world that matches in the seamlessness of the 3D plan of the Campo Marzio. And I'll give you some images. This is a space that we perceive, he writes, by creeping along the sides of the walls. We then follow the stairs, perceive the depths below, where more aerial flight of stairs is behelded. It is here that, according to de Quincey paraphrasing Coleridge, we repeatedly encounter Piranesi himself. The idea is that all these figures in which walk up and down the stairs, usually up actually, are many little Piranesi, faceless Piranesis. Now this is where normally studies of this text in relation to the images stop, with the identifying these faceless figures with Piranesi. But I think we need to place the emphasis on the very end of the text, which usually is ignored. With the same power of endless growth, the Quincey writes, and self-reproduction, did my architecture proceed in dreams. Is this what he writes? Is this what he imagines through the verbal account of another artist? What is this architecture that proceeds in dreams and produces endless growth? Or is it not already happening already in Piranesi's project? So we need to look at this idea of movement and incorporation, not in the Quincey's words, but in how Piranesi performs it. The spaces of the Cartography not only question the form and the finitude of architecture to propose an architecture of change, but their change includes the architect. It's no longer the author in control of his own work, but he's always already an observer, an inhabitant of the process of an architecture whose final outcome he cannot predetermine and control. Let's say with the Quincey interpretation. So he says we have this Piranesi, small, multiple, and faceless, who inhabits the Carceri. He moves through their spaces, is capable only of partial journeys through them, and he's unable to draw impossible new connections from within. He's lost himself. And when he is immersed in the space of his own creation, that is, once the architect has relinquished the power of the line traced by his pencil, or in this case the burin, the recomposition of spaces is possible only in one way, through the experience of moving through them. So when he reworks the copper plates of the first stage to produce the second set of prints, the Cartography of Invention, Piranesi multiplies details, but also the presence of these observers, voyagers. And in fact, their repetition and their movement is actually more interesting and more important for us than the true identity of these faceless characters. They're small, they're faint, they're nearly transparent. They move lightly on these impossible stairs and balconies. They are visible, in a way, only to us, to the external viewer. And in a way, they are extraneous to the image, but they are the keys for an interpretation of the tensions, the ideas which are contained in this space of movement. And while the many combined perspectives of the images may seem incongruous, and they actually don't match, they're broken, they're contradictory, they represent an impossible space, but the representation becomes a four-dimensional, spatial, temporal labyrinth for the architect. And that is how we need, and it's actually the only way we can read them. What does this mean? That once he is introjected by the image of this impossible space of his own invention, the architect becomes a sort of Daedalus trapped in the labyrinth of his own device. So not only is lost in its interiors, but is absorbed and incorporated in architecture. And again, here we need to distinguish and look at the notion of incorporation in this context, because it contains always embedded already in its meanings the plurality and the ambiguity that define the relationship of Piranesi the author and Piranesi the inhabitant to the spaces of his own design. This is a very simple but complex dictionary definition. So if we look at the possible notions of incorporation, the notion of inclusion in, and I quote, something already formed, and that of giving material form are to be privileged here over the notion of wholeness. In a way, there is no united whole in Piranesi's assemblages. as they all suggest infinite spaces which are suspended in a tension between centripetal and centrifugal forces. So what is interesting in these definitions is the possibility of reading incorporation itself as an open and possibly inexhaustible potential of combination or inclusion for something that is already formed. In other words, that which is already formed is actually not finished. So the already formed is neither closed nor static, but remains transformable. And this is really where Piranesi becomes interested in working with ruins and antiquity. So we can argue that Piranesi works in a similar way with, or rather within, the classical language of architecture. His work consists in an incorporation into the classical language, and his destabilizing work on architectural space is carried on from within the rules of the already formed products of the classical language. He performs incorporations as a process of unsettling and reworking the given from within. A second aspect of his incorporation goes beyond the notion of inclusion and derives from the definition of incorporation as an act of giving material form. And here the emphasis is to be placed on the material aspect of form, on the very material body of which Piranesi's incorporation works, the ruins, the stones, the buildings he finds. He works on architecture, and his work, far from being relegated to an abstract manipulation of rules, codes, images, typologies, is inextricably implicated with architecture's material being and with the weathering and the corruption of its materials. And this begins with an instrumental representation of the already broken, the damaged, the fragmented given of the ruin. So not the rules of architecture, but the partial remains of their implementations are represented here. And the representation becomes already a project. The materials of architecture, and materials as both the rules and proportions of architectural orders and the mass of ruined structures, are presented as possible pieces for new compositions. The notion of composition here needs to be redefined as well. It no longer requires the correspondence and concurrence of part into a whole, as classical architecture defined it, but it opened possibilities of juxtapositions, overlap, conflicts. The crumbling of classical architectures and structures is therefore not only physical in Piranesi's views of Rome, but becomes documentary in his books of the Roman antiquities and metaphorical in the prisons. And even lucrative in his own business, because Piranesi uses fragments taken, stolen, appropriated from ruins in his designs and fittings for interiors. Fireplaces, mantelpieces, urns, which he ships usually to England, actually. Sorry, digression. But it's an interesting that he was a very clever businessman, actually. But let's stay with the crisis of this architectural language, because he is deeply affected by it, by the crisis of the discipline and by the impossibility of defining a role for it in the city, in the outside world. There were no clients, patrons for him. He was not sufficiently well connected. He could not get architectural jobs. So in a way, this is a safe but very dangerous shelter into experimentation, which opens a lot of potentially risky suggestions. And what is important here is that he is literally trapped. He is the Daedalus who can't fly out, and that is why contemporary architecture continues to be interested in this project, because it is really the construction of visual and graphic questions. An issue which remains here is, what is the architect then? What is the question of authorship? What are these works, and what are the relation of the author to his own work? And who is this lost Daedalus? Is he really lost? How does he struggle to define his role? Piranesi keeps changing his name in time, and this is documented, of course, by the evolution of his signature on his work. And the oscillation of identity revealed not only an attempt to adjust to the architectural culture of the time, but also indirectly an ongoing redefinition of what architecture and its practice were. In a recent semi-fictionalized biography of Piranesi, unfortunately published only in Italian by Pierluigi Panza, Panza maps these changes, and I'm going to give you a summary here. He's baptized Zuanne. Zuanne is the draftsman in training. After his first Roman stay, where he prints his early etchings of the ruins of Rome, he starts signing in a Roman way. So Zuanne, which is the Venetian dialect, becomes Giobatta, short for Giovanni Battista. So the draftsman here has become a surveyor. And he's also an expert guide, a demonstrator, they're called, an antiquarian of Rome's ruins. We are in the mid-1740s. He signs the frontispiece of his Opere Varie as Salcindio Tiseo, a pseudonym, which he takes when he becomes member of the Academy of the Arcadi, whose affiliation recognizes him as an artist. Now he's become an artist. In the frontispiece of the Roman Antiquities, we are now in 1756, he includes his portrait as a classical bust, and he signs with a nobler name. Now he's Giovanni Battista. He's an archaeologist, antiquarian, and engraver. In Della Magnificenza ed Architettura dei Romani, 5 years later, a richly documented and illustrated text which offers a defense of the originality and primacy in Roman architecture, Piranesi becomes also an historian. He's not only working with his images, but he really writes. This is a book which combines half and half images and text. And here he is, Gio Battista Piranesi, member of the Royal Academy of Antiquarians of London. And this is also the year when he is accepted as, again, an artist member of the Accademia di San Luca. He becomes Piranesi Architetto Veneziano. When in 66 completes the work on the church, his only finally built building, which was actually a refurbishment. The church existed already. The documents refer to him as Giobatta Piranesi Architetto Veneziano, and that's the same year where he's knighted in the Ordine dello Speron d'Oro, Giovanni Battista Piranesi Equitatus Aurate Milizie. So now he's Cavalier, Gio Battista Piranesi Architetto Veneziano. Why am I giving you all these titles? As for the Venetian remains what is. Why Venetian after 40, 50 years in Rome? He's not only Venetian for geographical and familiar provenance, but more importantly for his artistic background and formation. Venetian means that after a life and a career in Rome, he still has a will to remain other, different, and preserve a sort of uncomfortable but very liberating autonomy in his work. And yet something remains hidden, and the Italian painter and scholar Giuseppe Zigaina has discussed this very cleverly, and he refers to Piranesi's desire to be someone else. He's very uncomfortable with all his names and identities. He signs himself Veneziano, perhaps by being afraid of losing himself, of losing his identity in Rome. An architetto, an architect who dreams structures that cannot exist and doesn't build anything or very little. So Zegaina suspects that actually he's also a painter, even if he doesn't paint. At the same level of the Venetian artists of his time, let's not forget Tiepolo and other roughly contemporary. And this is, according to his argument, his secret. I'm not so sure, but what I'm interested in, what is the architecture that this Venetian architect produces if he is an architect? And how does he do it? And what does he say about it to justify what he does? There is no hope. There is no hope for him, he says, that an architect of our times can successfully execute anything similar to the Roman buildings of the past, be it the fault of architecture itself or of those who should act as patrons of this most noble art. No other option is left to me or to any other modern architect, of course referring to his times, than to explain his own ideas through drawings, and in this way to take it away from the abuse of those who possess wealth, because they don't give it to me, I would doubt, and who make us believe that they themselves are able to control the operations of architecture. To my colleague architects in the room, this probably sounds very familiar. And the comment may sound defeatist, but it actually advocates a very important critical and creative role for an architecture, even and possibly even more so when it's destined to remain on paper. Tafuri comments on this and recognizes the role of the invention, not just the invention and the invention of paper, but the circulation. These etchings were printed in thousands, about 5,000 copies for each image. So they circulated so widely that they were actually better known, much, much better known than the buildings and the ruins. So that is what becomes very important, but not so much because Tafuri points it out, but because Piranesi knew it and wrote it, and that is the most amazing thing. Of course, he was trying to defend his role, but his sketchbooks, and they're called the Modena sketchbooks because they are at the Biblioteca Estense, are typical artist notebooks with studies of his own projects, copies from existing buildings, but also shopping lists and estimates and costs, etc., etc. But he also produces a sort of, could say, a professional diary in it. And what he says here, and it's really just a scribble, it's not published or anything, the ancients did not have printing. And so the knowledge of these ancient things was lost. By means of these etchings, and he means mine basically, it will be possible to see what will be destroyed. And then he concludes in a very schematic way, in another annotation, the moderns have found things that are more important. And then on the side, skeletons as they were. So for Piranesi, the true monuments are in the images, in the prints and in the books. That is, in reproduction, a reproduction that can multiply and perpetuate them and diffuse their knowledge. And this is, well, 2 centuries almost before Walter Benjamin. The skeletons represent life, and it's a life that is destroyed and then rots. And monuments last, but they too, Piranesi argues, are destroyed. And what remains, what preserves ideas, what speaks to us, is the printed page. So this, they're now being reproduced and published, these sketchbooks. It's an amazing finding. It's a remark that justifies Piranesi's own work as engraver, printer, and publisher, but it also shows his awareness of the fundamental role of his work in and for architecture through images. And the images continue to talk, and they continue to talk not only in architecture, but also in other fields. And I'll just show you an example to conclude. A few years ago, English photographer Emily Allchurch produces a project entitled Urban Chiaroscuro. she reconstructs through fragments of photography, collaging them, the images of Piranesi's sculpture and proposes them as open and vulnerable and violated urban spaces with very sophisticated photo collages that recombine contemporary urban fragments into the image defined by Piranesi to show that indeed these are the city and we inhabit these impossible spaces now. So we return here to the process of collage and montage as a critique. But there's a difference here. The shift is from the, let's say, the individual introjection of the modern metropolis, of the shock produced by it, as theorized and proposed in Hausmann's collage, to a contemporary fragmentation and dispersal, which we, happily or not so happily, inhabit. Old Church's Rome is like Piranesi's Rome. It's a synchronous representation of many different presents. There is no past in Piranesi's Rome, but an incessant, complex and difficult present. The glorious past is no longer something to freeze and look at with admiration, but an ever-present challenge and a material difficult to work with. And we still do it anyway, and this happens not only in Rome, but also, for instance, in London, because this is a tube station. Or maybe it's not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, now's the time for questions, comments. Yes, Rebecca.
Congratulations, that was fantastic. I've got a really sort of half-formed question in my head, which is about allegory, probably. So I'm particularly interested in the moments when you talked about time and fourth dimension, and but also with the collages at the end in relation to the lack of people. So one of the things I'm interested, and obviously you mentioned Benjamin, which is probably what I would have got to. So do you think, I suppose, that the fourth dimension is allegorical? And so by that I mean, which is a really complicated question, but what I'm actually asking is, to what degree are, for instance, the figures, the passing of time into that fourth dimension? And if it is allegorical, is it a Benjamin-esque allegory, which is kind of around, you know, God's always going to win and man's always going to lose and that kind of thing? Or is there something else being said there which is kind of more about buildings?
I don't think there's allegory in Piranesi at all. He doesn't refer to symbols. If he does, he explains them and destroys their very symbolic nature the moment he does it. I had another conclusion in mind, but it was not very decent. So anyway, next time when I do it with the students. But it's no, Piranesi. I think uses, well, there's the general use of staffage in the images to give a sense of scale and proportion, which is usually exaggerated and faked. But Piranesi doesn't do it very much. He really simply documents the life he sees, especially in the views of Rome. So the decision is in deliberately including it, rather than removing it, as most other etchings do. He showed beggars, he showed disfigured bodies. They become one with the material of the city, which must have been a mess at the time of mud and ruin and rubble. So he just does not edit out. So I don't think, I don't know what the opposite of an allegory is, but it's there. It's what's there. So even the ruins.
Documentary rather than allegory is what
but it's even deciding to be documentary. Let's say, I don't know if it's realistic, but back then was incredibly powerful and provocative. The ruins are shown, with grass and weeds growing in the cracks of the stones, and so it is just there, and it doesn't edit out. While other people do, even Old Church, or when Basilico photographs reproduces the views of Rome exactly from the same point of view, and the monuments are still there. He tries to wait for times when there's no people, no cars in front of buildings. So this sort of life is removed normally, and he leaves it there. He probably produces it. But another thing on the removal, let's say, of symbol is when Piranesi is a bit younger than Giambattista Nolli, so he works for Nolli. He actually learns a lot from Nolli. Nolli produces this still used gigantic plan of Rome, but there's also a small Nolli, like a book version, which is actually the most sold of them. And Piranesi produces a frontispiece for Nolli, because he was working for him, for the small Nolli. And there's an interesting difference that while the frontispiece for the large version shows, classical divinities and symbols of architecture, and I'm sorry I don't have the image now, but the one Piranesi does, which has the same layout as the title, and then there are figures around on the corner and at the bottom, but it does a distorted catalogue of buildings, and they're ancient buildings, they're contemporary buildings, they're damaged, they're sinking in mud. So he replaces all the possible symbols of divinity or power with, again, the reality as it is there. So, I don't know if I've answered.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes. I would like to thank you very much for bringing up this. I am now over 10 years retired, having worked till 75 in architectural practice, and having started off in the days of the Beaux-Arts school of following all these kinds of drawings, and finding in my rather historic practice in Leeds, in our archives, we had over 1,000 Piranesi etchings, along with Colin Campbell's Vitruvius, 3 volumes, 17.
Where are they now?
These were available and expected to inspire us in our modern work. And your conclusion at the end of this was exactly like my experience, that in our drawings and explanations to clients, the secret was to educate and bring and illustrate in exactly this kind of way the things that you were proposing to a client, so that the client believed that it was his idea. And then you were on the straight path.
Yes.
Now it's wonderful at the end of what I thought was a lone path, well, with many of us contemporary in the same sort of way, that now the new generation comes along with the same information and bringing forward the same. It's been a great pleasure to hear this.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to hear you. Thank you.
Often you're
I know
described
you
as the
want.
new generation.
I know.
But it's-
Yeah. Well, no. I teach the new generation. I was trying to.
Well, that's an excellent
Thank
little
you.
comment. Thank you, sir, for that interjection. If you need a home for your 1,000 Piranesi, I'm sure you can find one.
Sorry, they were all sold on the market.
Oh, well.
10 years or more
Well,
ago.
there we are.
There was no way I could keep them.
Of course not. No. It's jesting. Anyway, any further comments? Yes. No.
Thank you, Teresa, for such a really amazing journey back. And I just can't help to think, if let's say the seeds of modernity is being redefined through Piranesi, then how about Johnson, 50 years later, and then the set of drawings. And actually I can't help the image of the back of his house, where he's got the collection of his objects, and then the catacomb space that he constructed. and for me, there's a very, very vivid and very material connection to what Piranesi is doing on the surface of these metal sheets, where Stone is doing it through another material means. And then the idea about the representation of ruins being kind of hidden away from academy and only revealed perhaps 30 years or 50 years later. And I just wonder if there's kind of episodes of these kind of symptoms being mapped out also.
Well, Stone is, in a way, later. Stone is the one who collects the Piranesi, and actually the late Piranesi, because he's got the Pestum drawings, etchings. And Piranesi is more disrespectful because he challenges, he recombines, he destroys more. And I think in that sense is more interesting, besides the fact that he remains the most amazing draftsman, because he really drew on the copper. He just drew on the copper. So a few years ago there was this big exhibition at the museum in Ghent, and it was in the context of Roman etching at the time, and you could tell that's Piranesi. Because Piranesi moves even when he draws a view of a document. His drawings move, and he inserts those accidents, and then whether they were actually there and they were edited out in other collections and in other images, I don't know. But to go back to Stone, it's interesting because he's got the Pestum, and they're hidden. No? You need to perform this, and the Pestum views are really a film through images, are a journey through these spaces. So Piranesi does that, but he also is quite honest about it, because people were refusing to accept the fact that these were not Greek polished, white, perfectly proportioned buildings, and so. Are they what? Primeval, Roman, pre-Roman, Greek, a contamination of. So they continue to be referred as, Greek or whatever. And Piranesi is the one who again represents them as they are, and is interested more in the massive quality of them, and in how you perceive them when you approach them, and what is the best way to represent them from different points of view. I'm just saying that I think Piranesi is more interesting, and he does it before.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Just like to take this opportunity, I think, to thank you again, Professor Stoppani, for an interesting talk. I must say some of the images reminded me of my first visit to Charles de Gaulle Airport, things disappearing upwards, and I'm pretty sure that one of those escalators led nowhere. But thank you once again, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along and enjoying a splendid talk. We just thank Teresa in the usual way.